Welcome to the final day of the Inaugural Human Rights Commission Civil Rights Conference. I am Representative Kevin Coach Christie, Chair of the Human Rights Commission. On behalf of the Human Rights Commission, I am honored and humbled to introduce Richard Rothstein, the author of The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. A distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In addition to his recent book, The Color of Law, he is the author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found at his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute. Of special interest, class and schools using social, economic, and educational improvement to close the Black and white achievement gap, and grading education, getting accountability right. He welcomes questions and comments at the address listed in the chat. So let's give a tremendous Vermont welcome to our keynote speaker, Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christie. I appreciate your all coming here today to engage with me in this conversation. Let me begin by reminding all of us something we all know, and that is that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. That civil rights movement began by challenging segregation in elementary and in colleges and universities, first law schools, then colleges and universities, and then in 1954, abolished segregation in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown versus Board of Education decision gave impetus, a stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists, civil rights movement of activists. They engaged in marches, in demonstrations, in civil disobedience. Some lost their lives, others were injured. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everybody, but pretty much persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites. It was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. Because of that understanding and the pressure that the activism of the civil rights movement was able to create, we abolished segregation and public accommodations and interstate transportation, in employment. In 1968, we passed a Fair Housing Act that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much ended, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. I lived in many areas. Everyone was racially segregated. I think many of you probably have lived in some metropolitan areas, if not many, and every one of those was residentially segregated. How can it be we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy? And yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all. It's a puzzle. Partly, of course, it's because ending residential segregation is hard. If we abolish segregation in lunch counters or buses or public accommodations, pass an ordinance saying you can no longer segregate a restaurant, the next day you can sit in any restaurant. But if we pass a law saying you can't have segregated neighborhoods anymore, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, uh, all of us adopted a rationalization, an excuse, a myth we give ourselves for failing to redress the biggest segregation of all. And that myth goes something like this. It says that the residential segregation is different from all the other forms of segregation that we abolished in the 20th century. If the federal government was requiring segregation in interstate transportation, for example, that was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, a civil rights violation. We have an obligation to remedy it. If state and local governments were requiring segregation in restaurants or buses or other institutions, it's also a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment, and we're obligated to remedy that as well. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. It's not a civil rights violation. It just sort of happened naturally. It happened because, bigoted white homeowners or landlords refused to sell or rent homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because private businesses, banks, real estate agencies, developers discriminated in how they carried out their private sector activities. They weren't agents of government. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because African Americans and whites like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. We'd rather self-segregate. Or maybe we say it's because of economic differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites. Not all, but on average. And so many African Americans can't afford to move to higher income neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted perhaps, but non-governmental decisions is what created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened naturally, what happened by accident can only unhappen by an accident. It's too bad. Most of us think it's too bad. We live in what's in effect an apartheid society, but we don't feel any obligation to do anything about it. Well, as you heard Mr. Christie say when he introduced me, I spent a lot of time writing about education policy. I actually spent most of my time writing about education policy until I came to the topic of this book, The Color of Law. In the 1990s and 2000s, I spent most of my time criticizing the dominant educational theory of the country at that time. And that was that we have an achievement gap between black and white children. Black children, on average, achieve at lower levels than white children. But the reason we have an achievement gap, this theory went, was because teachers have low expectations of black children. They're bigoted. They don't try very hard to teach black children. And if somehow we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory, but it was enacted into law, bipartisan law in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act. The No Child Left Behind Act said that we should begin testing children every year, hold teachers and schools accountable for those test scores. And if we do so, the achievement gap will disappear. That's all it takes. As I said, it was a ludicrous theory. It turned out, of course, not to work at all. The achievement gap today is as great as it was to most extent as in 2001 when this law was passed. All the No Child Left Behind law accomplished was it got many, many schools serving disadvantaged children to drop a well-rounded curriculum and instead spend much of their time drilling in math and reading in a fruitless effort to raise test scores. But that was the law. I thought that it was silly because although there are some teachers who have low expectations, who are bigoted, who don't try very hard, that's not the reason we have an achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap is primarily because of the social and economic conditions that children come to school with that impede their ability to take advantage of what the good schools have to offer. And so I wrote column after column about the conditions that actually cause the achievement gap. One column I remember I wrote was about asthma. As you may know, in urban areas, African-American children have asthma at about 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely, not necessarily every child, but more likely than children without asthma, to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day. If you have two groups of children who are identical in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement, simply because a drowsier group is not going to achieve as well as a wide-awake group, all other things being equal. Well, that contributes a little bit to the achievement gap, but there are many, many other causes, conditions like that. Lead poisoning that is disproportionately affects African-American children and has a measurable impact on IQ. Homelessness, economic insecurity. All of these, you could do a similar analysis. Two groups of children, identical in every respect, but one group has one of these conditions. They're going to have lower average achievement. And when you've gone through all of these social and economic disadvantages that low-income African-American children come to school with, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. Of course, a tiny bit of it is caused by low expectations of teachers, but that's not the main thing. Well, this is what I was writing about and studying. And then I began to realize it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. What happens when you have a school where every child has one or more of these conditions? How could you ever expect a school like that to achieve at the same level where children come to school healthy, well-rested, well-nourished, in economically secure homes? You can pass a law expecting it, but it won't accomplish what you expect. Well, we call those schools where we concentrate children with these kinds of social and economic disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So neighborhood segregation, I came to conclude, was an educational problem. And that's why I began to look into this. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that involved two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of these districts implemented a very trivial school desegregation plan. They gave the parents of the children in those districts the choice of which school their child would attend. But if the choice was going to further exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't do so. So if you had a school that was all white or mostly white, both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, the black child would be given some preference. Help to desegregate the school. It was a trivial program. How often do you have one place left and both a black and a white child apply for it? But the Supreme Court examined this program, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. Justice Roberts explained that it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, but he said, they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. He was right about that. And he went on to explain that neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto for all the reasons I described before. Private bigotry, actions of private businesses, people's self-choice, income differences. And he said, well, you have de facto segregation, something that happened naturally by accident, wasn't created by government. The government is prohibited from doing anything to redress it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something some years before that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the districts that was concerned with this decision. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in an all-white single-family home suburb called Shively. That suburb, all white, as I said, the homeowner in that suburb had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. That African-American friend had a decorated Navy veteran, was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this single-family home area of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family and thereby provoking a riot. I thought about this and I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the courts, the entire criminal justice system are mobilized in an effort to maintain racial segregation in the Louisville community. I began to look into it further, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you this, but there were hundreds and hundreds of cases of police-protected, frequently police-led and organized mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in previously all-white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police was leading, protecting, organizing violence against African Americans, was a 14th Amendment violation, a violation of the Constitution, a civil rights violation. We have an obligation as American citizens to remedy every one of these hundreds and hundreds of cases, and we've never taken up that responsibility as American citizens. Well, I began to look into it a bit further, and I found that it wasn't just police protected, organized, or led violence in an unconstitutional fashion that created the segregation that we know today. But there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, all racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. Every one of them was a constitutional violation. Every one of them a civil rights violation that we have an obligation to remedy, and we've never taken up that responsibility either. The notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. We were created as a segregated society by unconstitutional federal policy. So let me describe some of the federal policies, a couple I maybe have time for, that were most responsible for creating the segregation that we have today. Perhaps the most powerful one was a policy of the federal government in the post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white working class and middle class population, to move them out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs like that one of Shively that I described before. Let me say at this time, in the World War II, post-World War II period, we were not yet a suburban country. The people living in suburbs at that time were affluent. Working class, middle class families weren't living in suburbs. They were living in cities because we were a manufacturing economy. And factories had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals so they could get their parts and ship their products by either ship or by rail. And if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, they all had to live reasonably close to that factory district because most of them were walking to work or taking short streetcar rides. Few had automobiles. So you had many, many integrated downtown urban areas in the mid-early 20th century. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to that time somehow to see the extent of integration that existed in urban areas. But the federal government designed to end that, to move the whites in those communities out of their apartments into single-family homes in all white suburbs and leave African Americans behind in those cities. This was an explicit federal policy. You're familiar with all of these suburbs everywhere in the country. We created a white noose around black neighborhoods everywhere. The most famous of these suburbs is probably, if you haven't heard of any others, you've probably heard of Levittown, east of New York City. Levittown, a community of 17,000 homes, created in the immediate post-war period. The developer, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to buy the land and build 17,000 homes in one place to create a suburb that people thought was a crazy idea because we weren't yet a suburban country. Nobody thought anyone would want to live there. No bank would be crazy enough to lend the money to do it. The only way that Levitt could get the funds, and this is true of all the developers like him, builders everywhere in the country, in every metropolitan area, the only way he could get those funds was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the project, the construction materials he was going to use, the architectural design of the homes, the layout of the streets, and a required commitment that the FHA and the VA made him, insisted that he make, never to sell a home to an African American. The FHA and VA even required Levitt and all of these builders everywhere in the country in the post-war period to include a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was an explicit requirement of the federal government. If any of you live in homes in a subdivision that was constructed in the mid-20th century, look at your deeds. You might find you're living in a home that's for Caucasians only, even though it's no longer enforceable. Once it's in there, you can't change the deed any more than you can wake up in the middle of the night and say, I want to change my property line. What's in the deed is in the deed. You can't change it, but it's unenforceable now. But this was, I say, not the action of rogue bureaucrats in the FHA and VA. It was written in federal policy manual called the Underwriting Manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend the application of builders, of developers, to create these subdivisions. The manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee the proposal of a developer who was going to sell homes to African Americans in an otherwise white neighborhood. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who was going to build an all-white project that was located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion, as I say, of de facto segregation has no basis in reality. We have an unconstitutionally created system of segregation in this country. And because it was unconstitutionally created by the federal government, we have an obligation to remedy it. Well, this particular policy, the suburbanization of the white urban population in the mid-20th century, still determines to a great extent the segregation that we have today. Those homes sold at the time, Levittown houses sold for $8,000 a piece. In today's inflation-adjusted money, that's $100,000. As you know, those homes no longer sell for $100,000 in any metropolitan area of this country. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, $1 million or more. The white working class families who were subsidized by the federal government on a racial basis to move to these single family homes in these suburbs became middle class. They acquired wealth from the equity they had in their homes as they appreciated in value. Most Americans who have any wealth get it from the equity they have in their homes. The white families use this wealth to send their children to college. They use it to perhaps take care of emergencies, medical emergencies or unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this wealth-generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story about that. I don't have time to go into it today with you, but there are unconstitutional actions that supported that income gap as well. But it's a 60% income ratio. You'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, While African-American families have 60% on average of the incomes of white families, African-American wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that we have an obligation to remedy. Well, that wealth gap determines much of the racial inequality we have today. I described earlier how the concentration of African Americans with serious social and economic disadvantages in single schools creates an achievement gap in schools. It creates health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancy and greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods. The wealth gap and the segregation that it perpetuates is responsible in significant part for the mass incarceration and police abuse, instances of police abuse that we spent so much time focused on in the last few months and years. I'm not suggesting that no police officers would ever discriminate against African Americans if it weren't for segregation, but certainly the segregation exacerbates it greatly. When you concentrate the most disadvantaged young men without access to good jobs or transportation to get to those jobs in single neighborhoods, it's inevitable that the police will engage in confrontations with them, that they will adopt the stance of an occupying force, much as occupying forces in colonial countries in the third world adopted that stance when they tried to control neighborhoods of disadvantage of native populations. It's the same thing that the same attitude the police have towards our low-income segregated neighborhoods today. And the segregation that we created and that we perpetuate with this wealth gap is also responsible for something else that we've had a lot of time to focus on in the last few months that I consider very, very dangerous and frightening. And that's the enormous political polarization that we have in this country today. Greater political polarization than anything in my memory. And as I look at your photos all over this webinar, I can see that my memory is longer than most of yours. That political polarization largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. And how can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to identify with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences, no ability, as I say, to develop a common national identity? Well, that's a consequence of the segregation that we have created. Let me just mention for a minute another policy that I think I have time for, another federal policy. It's public housing. We all think that public housing is something for poor people. It's not how it was created. Public housing, the first public housing was created in the New Deal during the Depression and the Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. We had a 25% unemployment rate at that time. Public housing was for the 75% who had good jobs, stable incomes, who could pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. It wasn't subsidized. The federal government built the first housing in this country, public housing in this country for civilians in the 1930s, and everywhere it built it. It segregated it, creating separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently segregating neighborhoods that, as I said before, weren't entirely segregated at the time. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, some of you may be familiar with him, in his autobiography called The Big C, he describes how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. Commonplace in the country at that time, the central neighborhood of Cleveland, integrated, about half white, half black. You know, we'd be stunned if we were transported back to that period of American history to see the extent of integration in downtown areas that there was. Langston Hughes says that in this integrated neighborhood, he went to high school. His best friend in high school was Polish. Said he dated a Jewish girl there. What you'd expect to be seeing in an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Cleveland and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation where it hadn't previously existed with those and with other equally segregated projects elsewhere in the Cleveland metropolitan area. Someplace closer in home to you, you may have heard of it, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cambridge, the area between Harvard and MIT in the 1930s, was a fully integrated neighborhood, about half white, half black. Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, segregating people who had previously been living amongst each other and creating a pattern of segregation, not only in Cambridge, but with other projects elsewhere in the Boston area that persists to this day. During World War II, the government created segregation in the West Coast that hadn't previously existed. Hundreds of thousands of workers, white and black, migrated to the West Coast to take jobs in war industries, jobs that hadn't existed before. And if the government wanted the ships and the airplanes and the tanks and the jeeps to be produced, it had to find housing for these migrant workers, and it did. Everywhere it did, everywhere that war plants were located, not just on the West Coast, but throughout the country, the government built housing for war workers, segregating it always, separate projects for blacks, separate projects for whites, frequently segregating workers who are working together in the same war plants. In my book, I have a photograph of a plant where jeeps and tanks were being produced, black and white workers working together, but they were required to live separately. In San Francisco, government built 5 public housing projects for war workers, 4 were for whites only, 1 for African Americans. Same policy was practiced in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast. That's why the West Coast today is segregated. Hadn't been prior to that time. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. No mystery about them. Think tanks, policy experts, journalists like me spin out ideas about how to redress segregation all the time. There's no mystery about the policies. What's missing is not policy ideas, but a new civil rights movement, like the one in the 1960s, that's going to take action to make it uncomfortable to maintain the practices and boundaries of segregation that we have in this country and that were created in an unconstitutional fashion. I just mention a couple of the policies so you can see how obvious they are that we should be following. Their absence is not because we don't know what to do. The absence is because there's no political support for them. Perhaps the most obvious one, I described those suburbs before that were created on an all-white basis at a time when African-American families could have easily afforded to move into them, and then are now unaffordable to working-class families of either race. The federal government should be buying up homes in places like that, in places like Levittown, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, whatever the homes now sell for, market rates, and reselling them at deeply discounted prices to African Americans who should be living there had their previous generations been permitted to buy into those developments, but who are excluded from it. Levittown, for example, is now about 1 to 2% African American as a result of the Fair Housing Act. Some African Americans have the $500,000 or thereabouts that enable them to move into a neighborhood like Levittown. But Levittown is in a neighborhood that's about 15% African American. So the difference between that 2% that the Fair Housing Act was able to address and the 15% that's the legacy of unconstitutional policy is the difference that the federal government now should address with an affirmative action program in housing. It doesn't do so only because there's no political demand for it, no political support for it. We have programs at the low income of the economic scale to redress segregation. We know what they are. We're not implementing them also because there's no political support for them. The biggest subsidy program we have for low income families is the low income housing tax credit. It's a tax credit that the Treasury Department, the U.S. Treasury Department, issues to states who then redistribute them to developers, nonprofit developers. The Federal Treasury Department regulations place a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That's crazy. It's the opposite of what we should be doing. It's not that we shouldn't be placing some low-income housing tax credit units in low-income neighborhoods. Every neighborhood should have better housing. But to place a priority on reinforcing segregation by placing a disproportionate share of those projects in low-income neighborhoods, that's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be placing the opposite priority on placing more of those units in high opportunity communities where there's access to jobs and transportation to get to them, and grocery stores selling health food and clean air. The Section 8 voucher program is another one that reinforces segregation. That program reinforces it because Section 8 vouchers aren't usable for the most part in any place but low-income neighborhoods. The voucher amounts are too low to rent apartments in high opportunity places. They're actually too high to rent in segregated neighborhoods, and landlords in those neighborhoods exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. That program should be redesigned so that we're increasing the voucher amount for high opportunity rentals and decreasing it for use in existing segregated neighborhoods. There are some communities that have started to do that, very, very few. But I can go on and on about these policy ideas. That's not the problem. The problem is that we don't have a new civil rights movement to make it impossible to ignore these solutions. I am now working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create something that they call a National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation, designed to create the kinds of local civil rights groups in local communities that can take action to redress segregation. I suppose I can get in touch with you and Amanda, perhaps after this webinar is over, and tell people how to sign up to be on the mailing list for this National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation if they're interested, and I'll be sure to do that. We have created in the book, The Color of Law, I describe how the textbooks that are used in every metropolitan area of this country, every school district in this country, every state in this country, lie about the history that I've just told you. They brag about the work that the government did to create housing during the New Deal, never mentioning that it was segregated housing. It boasts about the great work that the federal government did in creating suburbs for the first time for working class families, never mentioning it was for whites only. They lie about the notion of de facto segregation, promoted as though that is an accurate term to describe how we became segregated. Well, our National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation has developed a curriculum unit that can teach this history accurately. It's produced a 17-minute video for high school students that can be shown that summarizes this history. Both are free. And again, I can make the links available to you after this webinar if you're interested in organizing to press your local school district to examine how it's teaching the history of residential segregation. A couple of months ago, I wrote a column in the New York Times, perhaps some of you saw it, in which I picked one community that was created as a low-income, that created as an exclusively white suburban community in the 1940s. I identified in this article the bank, the real estate agency, the developer that cooperated with the federal government to create that community as an all-white exclusive community from which African Americans who could have afforded to live there were excluded. I argued in this article that a new civil rights group in that community could place pressure on that bank, that real estate agency, that developer that still exists today, or the successors exist today, to create a voluntary fund that would subsidize African Americans to move into white communities that they can't presently afford. I can send you the link to that as well. So the policies are well known. What's missing is a new civil rights movement to redress segregation. I am hopeful that if one like that gets organized in any of the communities where you live, that you will participate in it. With that, I think my time is up. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'd be glad to spend what time you have left in a discussion and answering whatever questions you might have. Thank you very much.
which is great. Thank you so much for that. We do have a few really great questions in the chat, and I would like to read them for you if that is okay. The first one comes from Rachel Batterson. She is the director of the Fair Housing Project at Vermont Legal Aid, and she wants to thank you for your work. Can you share some of your top recommendations for housing and zoning and planning policymakers in Vermont?
Well, I think I did already. I think the most important thing we could do is an affirmative action program in the housing area that would subsidize African Americans to move to communities that are presently unaffordable to them. I'm talking about the middle class, working class African Americans who cannot move to communities where their parents or grandparents could have moved to had they been permitted to do so. That's, I think, the most important thing. And there are communities around the country that are doing some of this. It's not like nobody is making any progress. There are communities that have established down payment assistance programs for people who were historically excluded from these communities. So that, I think, is the highest priority one. We should be abolishing exclusionary zoning rules. That is, rules or ordinances that prohibit anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes, or even single-family homes, period, from being constructed. No townhouses, no garden apartments, not even any low-level apartments. That serves to perpetuate an unconstitutionally created situation. In my judgment, a zoning ordinance that perpetuates an unconstitutionally created segregation is itself subject to challenge and should be challenged. Abolishing a single-family zoning won't in itself create desegregation, because even if we do so, most of the homes will still be unaffordable to African Americans. But that's a first step. It's a necessary step. If you don't abolish single-family zoning, you can't take the next steps that are necessary. So that's a high priority program. I mentioned before reform of both the low-income housing tax credit program and the Section 8 voucher program. There are some places that are doing that. It's not like it's not happening. There are some places, some states, that are doing a better job of placing low-income housing tax credit units in high opportunity communities. Some states and communities have prohibited discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. Most states have not. In most states, it's lawful for a landlord to say, I'm not going to rent to you simply because part of your rent is provided by a federal subsidy. So those are some of the top priority policies I think we should implement.
Thank you for that. I've done a fair amount of bias trainings, and what I've learned from that, there are some words that come up that make people really nervous. Some of those words are privilege, other words are fragility, and one of the words that is thrown out there a lot in discussions that also makes people really nervous is the word reparations. What does reparations mean to you, and does your book and your investigation make the case for that?
Well, I do want to come back to the part of your question about privilege. I'll come back to that later, but if I forget, remind me after I discuss reparations. If the term reparations is used in its proper sense, meaning to repair the damage that was done, I fully support reparations. Repairing the damage that was done requires a range of policies, some of which are expensive, some of which are cost-free. But most people don't understand the term reparations that way. They misunderstand it and think of reparations as simply meaning a single monetary payment to the current generation of African Americans. And that's inadequate. Such a payment, if it were ever enacted, and it's unlikely that it would be enacted, would never be large enough to compensate African Americans for the damage that was done by centuries of first slavery and then Jim Crow. And it would be, by making a payment to the current generation, we would be ignoring the fact that it took many generations to create this problem. It's going to take several generations to fix it, no matter how intentionally we try. So I'm in favor of the term reparations if it means a broad range of policies. Some would be expensive and cost money, like the affirmative action program in housing that I described before. Some would be cost-free. It doesn't cost anything to prohibit exclusionary zoning ordinances. So reparations in the sense of repairing the damage that was done is exactly what we should do. Making a single monetary payment to the current generation and then wiping our hands and saying, okay, we've taken care of the problem, is not what we should, where we should rest. Now, I said I wanted to address the term privilege before. I strongly object to the term white privilege. The returning war veterans who got those subsidies to buy homes in places like Levittown and these other suburbs that I was talking about, those white returning war veterans, were not privileged. They were getting something that every American should have had a right to, decent housing. It's not a privilege to have decent housing. It should be a right. The problem is not that whites were given the privilege of having decent housing. The problem is that African Americans were excluded from having that right. And I think we need to focus on the harm that was done to African Americans in general and in particular. The white families who were subsidized, returning war veterans, some of them heroes who were subsidized to buy those homes, should not feel ashamed of having been subsidized to do so. That's something that every government has a right to expect from, every citizen has a right to expect from its government. And the problem is that African Americans who had a right to expect that from their government were denied it.
Besides actively supporting home ownership, what can we do to close the wealth gap?
Oh, that's a great question. Home ownership is not necessarily the only way or even the best way to close the wealth gap. The only way that home ownership closes the wealth gap or narrows the wealth gap is if you're smart enough or lucky enough to buy a home in a neighborhood that's going to appreciate faster than inflation. When the white working class families in the post-World War II period were subsidized to move into single family homes in places like Levittown, they had no idea they were going to become wealthy by this practice. They had no idea that their homes were going to appreciate in value in this way, and neither did the federal government. This was something that was an unintended consequence of the home ownership program that the federal government promoted for white families. And many African American homeowners don't gain wealth from the ownership of their homes because property values in African American neighborhoods appreciate at a slower rate than property values in white neighborhoods because whites won't buy into those neighborhoods. And so the demand is low for those homes. So home ownership is important for a number of reasons. It's a good thing for people to have that kind of security. Some people would prefer to own their own homes, but closing the wealth gap should not be the main reason that we promote home ownership. The main way we should be closing the wealth gap, even though it was created by unconstitutional federal housing policy, is to address our income inequality so that people have enough incomes that they can save and create wealth in that way. We should be increasing the minimum wage, in my view, to a far higher level than we're now talking about, so that the occupations in which African Americans predominate can pay adequate living wages and provide enough wages so that families can save from their wages. We should be reauthorizing in a practical way, reforming the National Labor Relations Act so that workers have a practical right, not just an abstract right, to organize unions. That's practically impossible now because of the ways in which the National Labor Relations Act has been misconstrued by the courts and by administrative agencies so that they can raise their wages in that way. That's another program that we should pursue. We should enact health care reform so that families don't have to worry about what savings they have being wiped out by unexpected healthcare emergencies. That would enable them to preserve their savings or to increase them. So we should not think of increasing home ownership as the sole route, or maybe even not even the main route for increasing wealth of African Americans and closing the wealth gap.
Thank you. You mentioned a modern day civil rights movement. Do you see the social unrest that we've experienced and seen across the country this year as, would you call that the modern day civil rights movement? Do you support that?
I'm sorry, I'm just copying something from your chat. Somebody who wants me to
Yeah, definitely. Take your time.
Communicate with them. I'm sorry, just give me half a second.
Yeah, please.
Okay, sorry. Well, I'm very encouraged by the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. 25 million Americans participated in those demonstrations, mostly white, unheard of in any previous time. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race in this country than we ever have had before in American history. I'm not saying this to boast, but it's not just my book that's had a stunning reception, but if you look at the bestseller lists of books, you'll find most of the nonfiction books have to do with race. We're having a phenomenally accurate discussion about race in this country today. We have white elected Southern politicians running around the South, removing statues that commemorate the defenders of slavery. There are other books I mentioned on the bestseller list, the Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. All of these should be read. So we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than we ever have had before in American history. I'm confident. Well, I'm not confident. I'm hopeful. That's, I guess, your answer to your question. I'm hopeful that out of that discussion, out of energy that the Black Lives Matter movement and demonstrations generated, that a new civil rights movement can emerge. It won't happen automatically. It will take intentionality on the part of people who are now aware of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and are committed to remedy our constitutional violations. The Black Lives Matter demonstrations focused appropriately on reforms of policing, community policing, demilitarization of the police. But we need to address residential segregation, something the Black Lives Matter movement did not address and wasn't designed to address, because as I indicated in my talk, it's the residential segregation that underlies a good part of the police abuse of African Americans that they experience today. So I'm hopeful that this kind of a civil rights movement can emerge from the current awareness of our racial history, but it's going to take intentionality. It won't happen by its own.
And maybe we have time for one last question. We do have a lot of legislators here today, as well as community members. If you could leave us with one or two things that we could do in the state of Vermont, we're small, but we're motivated, that would sort of respond to the results of your investigation and the disparities that we see, what would those things be?
Well, I'm going to duck that question a bit. I'm telling a national story. I wish I could. I can't be familiar with every state and every community in this country. But I think if you can apply the things that I talked about to your community, I guess one thing that can be done everywhere, and so it can certainly be done in Vermont, is, as I mentioned, reform the way in which your schools teach this history. Because if the next generation, as I said, doesn't learn this history any better than we have, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So that's one thing that anybody in Vermont can do, together with their fellow citizens and their local communities, is look at how the history of slavery and Jim Crow are being taught, and make sure it's being taught accurately. And as I said earlier, I am going to send you some materials that you can use if you want to address this history. You should investigate your own communities. I guess, Burlington in particular, I guess. I don't know much about Vermont, but investigate the history of your own communities, as I did in this article that I'm going to send you about a community in California, to identify the banks, the real estate agencies, the developers, the insurance companies that contributed to the disadvantage of African Americans in your community, and then organize to try to press those current institutions to take some leadership in fixing the damage that they've done. So I'm sorry I can't give you specific information about Vermont. That's your job. All I can do is give you the framework.
Yes. Well, that is the end of our time. We are so thankful, so grateful, so honored to have had you here today. And we do have your contact information. We've shared that. So if anybody has any follow-up questions, they can certainly send that your way. And just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us in the state of Vermont and at the Human Rights Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Christie, for hosting this.
That was really just such a wonderful hour, and to hear about what that has looked like nationally, and then now to sort of switch and have a conversation about what that could look like in Vermont. I'm really excited and honored to invite our next guest speakers today to sort of lead us in a discussion, in a conversation about some of those difficult words that I've sort of brought up already. Talk about truth and reconciliation, land and reparations, and maybe give us a guide for the path forward. Please help me welcome to the virtual stage Representative Hal Colston, Representative Brian Cina, and our first Executive Director of Racial Equity, Xusana Davis.
So I want to, talk about why now is the time for Vermont to consider standing up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But before I do that, I want to say a little bit more about affirmative action and affirmative action for white people. And I want to share with you some facts of history, and probably many of them we haven't learned in school or even in college. But this will, I think, set the context of why we must consider a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to unpack and dismantle systemic and structural racism. Our country was founded in 1619 when the first 20 enslaved Africans arrived on the shores of Virginia. In the 17th century, European indentured servants are replaced by enslaved Africans. These white servants became first slave police with new rights, entitlements, and opportunities based on their whiteness. Slavery becomes racialized and the white race is born. From 1680 to 1705, Virginia's servant codes specify that white servants can testify in court, get freedom dues, a plot of land, and the right to marry someone else from European descent. Interracial marriage is banned. In 1790, the Naturalization Act. This was the first act of the new US Congress, and it permits free white persons, including immigrants from European countries, to become citizens, which leads the way for them to become landowners. Non-white immigrants are denied right of citizenship until 1952. 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico cedes half of its natural territory to the US Mexicans living north of the Rio Grande become citizens, but they no longer automatically own their family's land. Under US law, the land goes to those with papers, which Mexicans did not have. Mexican Americans become the first farm workers on the lands their families once owned. 1862, the Homestead Act makes 50 million acres of native land taken by force available to white settlers at little or no cost. 100 million acres are given free to the railroads. 1865, when slavery ended, the promise of 40 acres and a mule as reparations was never followed through by the federal government. 1887, the Dawes Land Allotment Act forbids communal land ownership by indigenous peoples and encourages Native Americans to sell their lands to whites. Millions of acres go to white squatters. 1935, the Social Security Act. Agricultural workers and domestic workers, primarily Mexican American, African American, and Asians are excluded. 1942 to 1946, between 110,000 and 120,000 Japanese Americans who lived on the Pacific coast were forcefully relocated to concentration camps. The majority of the internees were United States citizens. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, results in thousands of Black teachers and principals losing their jobs in Southern Black schools after these schools are integrated with white ones. School boards say that white parents will not let their children be taught by Black teachers. So the major beneficiaries of Brown v. Board of Education are thousands of whites, mostly female teachers, and mostly white male principals who got their jobs in these newly integrated schools. And I'm going to fast forward to 2018. You know, we just heard recently from Richard about some facts about the wealth gap. Well, the Institute of Policy Studies came out with a report. So for the average white household, for every dollar of wealth that they have, compares to 2 cents for the average African-American household. So therein lies the case for launching and standing up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to dismantle systemic and structural racism. Many years ago, Archbishop Desmond Tutu led an historic effort to create the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the wake of dismantling apartheid in South Africa. Up to the dissolution of apartheid, many lives of South Africans were destroyed and lost. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was put into place to capture these many stories of pain, hurt, and loss in order to begin the healing process of broken relationships. As a state representative, I will be introducing a bill in the next biennium, beginning in January, to stand up for Vermont, its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to understand the harm that systemic and structural racism creates for all Vermonters. I believe this structure is necessary if we want to heal from the wounds of racism. Reconciliation leads to forgiveness, that leads to healing, that leads to the renewal of broken relationships between people who identify as white and Black and Indigenous people of color. This movement is growing around the country in various cities and states, as well as the state of Maine, through the legislative process. And I'm imagining that in our state, we would take on this work in partnership with several statewide organizations that have a focus on achieving racial and social justice. I will pursue this strategy because these organizations have the ability to secure the foundation grants that will be necessary to fund this process. Why am I pursuing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? I believe as a state, if we are to dismantle systemic racism and put in place reparations for BIPOC or enact racial justice laws, we must come from a common place of reconciliation, healing, and understanding. And I truly believe that all of us are harmed and impacted by systemic and structural racism. The time for a Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission has come. So I would invite your thoughts, your comments, your questions about how we can pursue this effort and have Vermont finally face the mirror and deal with our past and our system of breaking the lives of so many Vermonters. Thanks.
Thank you.
Representative Cina?
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thanks, Hal, for your United States history lesson. I think it's good to put things in context and that you started there. And perhaps what I'll do is zoom in a little and reflect a bit about the history of Vermont and what happened here. So, you look at the history of Vermont, a state in which people have learned in our schools that there were no natives here, that natives just passed through this area and that it was sort of this wild territory for the taking. But that's not true. And that there were indigenous settlements all through the Green Mountains, and there are sacred sites all through the Green Mountains, and that the Abenaki people of the Green Mountains were part of the Wabanaki Confederacy and traded with surrounding tribes for thousands and thousands of years. And that as white settlers moved in from the coast, conflict emerged, and that conflict played out through the French and Indian War, for example, leading up to the Revolutionary War, where Abenaki warriors fought side by side with the Green Mountain Boys. But what happened after the war? And as a state, we would really we need to address what really happened in Vermont. We need to look at what really happened after the Revolutionary War in Vermont, leading up to the Civil War, and what happened at the founding of the Republic of Vermont. There's many myths about Vermont that have gone on for too long. One of them is the myth I just said, that it was an unpopulated area. That's not true. Another is that Vermont was the first state to abolish slavery. It's also not true. Look at the Constitution. Look at Article 1 today, and look what it says. Slavery is still permitted in Vermont, according to our Constitution. And this is why, over the last 4 years in the legislature, we've pushed to pass Proposition 2, which would actually prohibit slavery and indentured servitude in our Constitution. So hopefully in the next biennium, we'll pass that, and then it can go to the voters so that we can amend our Constitution. And if we look at the history of the institution of slavery in Vermont, there were enslaved people in Vermont. And there were enslaved people in Vermont all the way up until the Civil War. Just here in Burlington recently, I believe it's the Stepping Stones Project, commemorated a house where enslaved people lived on Main Street. So the question is, how did slavery continue as an institution in the state where it allegedly was the first state to prohibit it? And it's because there was a lawless class of elites, Supreme Court justices, legislators, governors, who continued to hold enslaved people. And so, this is part of the trauma that a lot of people are living with today. A lot of Black Americans who are descendants of enslaved people. This gaslighting that goes on about what really happened, in our state and in our country. And if you look at, there's this myth, there's not a lot of people. There's Vermont's all white people. Not in my neighborhood, and not as long as I've lived here, which is only 22 years. But then I talk to families who lived here for generations. There have been Black people in Vermont for hundreds of years. In fact, there's evidence there may have been more in the past. Where did they go? Well, what happened in Vermont since the Civil War? What happened in Vermont in the 20s and 30s? If we look at our history, we hear about KKK rallies all over the state against not only Black Americans, but Italian Americans, French Canadians, Abenaki. People were driven out of the state. people were driven into hiding. And then we look at what comes next, the eugenics movement, birthed here in Vermont, just, I'm in the Old North End, just up the hill at UVM. The eugenics movement, which was an inspiration to Hitler and to the Nazis. The eugenics movement, which, I meet Abenaki elders who tell me stories from their family of chasing away the white women nurses with their guns when they came with the police to take children. And that's why they're here today and their grandchildren are here today, because they actually fought back and didn't let the state take the children. So, I'm just giving you some examples of what happened here in Vermont. We really need, as a society, to come to terms with this trauma. And we need processes. I'm a psychotherapist in my regular life, and I specialize in treating trauma. And one of the things that trauma is, when trauma happens to an individual, it's like a broken bone that doesn't heal right. If you have a traumatic experience and the right conditions, you will heal and you will become stronger from that trauma. But if the conditions aren't right, you still move on. But the bone didn't set right. The bone, and a lot of us are living with that. We know, there's in the Matrix, Neo goes to Morpheus, seeking wisdom, and Morpheus says to Neo, there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. And that's like that quote, really, when I hear it, that's how I think about the systemic trauma. Like, we know something's wrong. And we just walk around acting like everything's fine in denial. But until we actually come to terms with that splinter, we won't heal as a society. And so we do need processes of truth and reconciliation. We need processes of healing as a society. And the first step is the truth telling. And I have done a lot of work looking into what other countries did, like Australia or South Africa, for example, where the first step is truth telling. We need to tell the truth about what happened in Vermont and in this country. We need to own it, put that trauma in its place, and not just look at it as a story of suffering, but then look at the story of survival and build on that. And we need to move forward in a way that promotes collective liberation and healing. So in terms of policy, in the next session, in the past session, I worked with others to introduce a bill for a reparations task force. And the task force would do some of this work on uncovering the history and telling the story, and then looking at a proposal for what needs to be done for reparations. And as a member of the steering committee of the Racial Justice Alliance, we are reintroducing that bill. And we have talked internally about truth and reconciliation versus reparations, and we landed in a place of that we believe that the experience of Black Americans who have descended from enslaved people needs to be respected and honored on its own, and not necessarily covered in a bigger process. That needs to be dealt with first. I will also say that in my work with the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs, we've talked about this issue of truth and reconciliation. And the recommendation coming from the commission is that the state empower the commission and give the commission funding to recommend a process, and that process be led by the indigenous people of Vermont. And we looked a bit at what happened in Maine with truth and reconciliation. And it looks like in Maine, it was partnership between the leadership of the tribes and the executive branch that led to a process. So the commission is, the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs is asking that the state let them take the lead in designing a process of truth and reconciliation for the impact of colonization on the Abenaki people. But I share these two examples because, although the approach Representative Colston mentioned is different than these approaches, the problem is the same. The problem is the same here, which is until we recognize the truth of what happened, until we tell the real story, uncover the hidden stories, and make meaning of the trauma, we will continue to go around in circles as a society, and we're putting Band-Aids on an infection. We're not letting the infection drain. We're not letting that wound heal. So it's really important that in the next session, we look at acknowledgement of history. And you're going to hear from the Racial Justice Alliance Act, ACT. The A is acknowledgement. The C is going to be creation of new programs. And the T is going to be transforming state systems. And the Racial Justice Alliance, we're going to be bringing forward like 11 bills. I know it sounds like a lot for my colleagues, but that address all these different pieces. And some of them, you know, another example, maybe that I'll pass it on because I have a non-Western sense of time, so I don't know how long this has been. But so maybe someone could tell me in the chat. But I'll just leave you with this, that, you know, we're not just looking at the acknowledgement and the recommendations. We also need to get started on stuff. It's, you know, it's not okay to just, oh, we're gonna, you know, we're gonna have a conversation. We're gonna have conversations. We're gonna talk. You know, this is like common government kind of behavior. You know, constant talking, exploration, and studying. We need to do that, but we can't just do that. We got to take some action. We know there's a problem, so let's not wait around any longer. So when we look at the C and the T, these are very real actions we're going to be asking the state to take. In the C, the creation, we're going to be asking for massive investment in economic development opportunities for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the state of Vermont. And there's growing support in the community for this because people recognize that it hasn't been fair, and they recognize that there's strength in our communities of color in Vermont that we need to invest in. And that the communities of color give a lot to this state, have historically and not been acknowledged for it, and continue to this day. And in the T, the transforming state government, I'm working with partners from around the state on an initiative to look at BIPOC home ownership and land ownership. Like that the state should invest some money and time and energy into increasing land ownership for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, both private home ownership and collective land ownership. We're also going to be recommending more changes to the criminal justice system and law enforcement reform, reimagining public safety. We're going to be looking at healthcare disparities and investments in the healthcare system to change the culture in the healthcare system. It's completely unacceptable that studies show that some doctors view the pain of a Black person as less than the pain of a white person. Just think about that for a minute. You know, that there are healthcare providers who, seeing two patients, will view one's pain as less than the other for no other reason than the color of their skin. We have to do something about that. It's not fair. It's not right. So that's another example. You know, so we're going to be coming forward with a strong policy agenda to look at acknowledging the historical harm, creating new programs, and transforming existing state systems so that we can move from a system, a history of oppression and colonization to a new era of collective liberation and healing. So I'll stop at that point because I really want to hear what Xusana has to say and leave time for questions. I did get a little heads up that I had a few minutes, so I think I'm ending within the limit too. So thank you for the reminder, and thank you everyone for hearing me out. I have spoken.
Thank you. Up next, Xusana Davis, our very first Executive Director of Racial Equity.
All right. Buenas tardes, everybody. Xusana Davis, Racial Equity Director for the state. Very happy to be here. I actually am going to have the privilege of sort of moderating for the remainder of our time here. And there's been so much said already by Representatives Colston and Cina that we could spend another couple of hours discussing just the bit that they've shared with us. But one common thread that I found in their comments, Representative Colston talked a lot about the history of the United States, the history of unjust policy, and the way that those unjust policies have infiltrated our legal and social and economic systems. Rep. Cina went on to contextualize that within Vermont and do a little bit of myth busting. In Vermont, we have very lofty views of who we are and who we were. And we should. Vermont is a great place. And yet, truth matters so much. It matters how we frame our state's history, whether we were the first to do XYZ, or whether we were the first to do a modified version of XYZ, whether there were people held in servitude in our state or not. Their existence is everything for our future. And so one common thread that I saw between their comments was that equity practitioners, civil rights practitioners, those who are working to advance equity, often find themselves having to do very basic information, just education to an audience before you can get into recommending policy changes or explaining why things need to be modified or corrected. At first, there's just basic information, level setting that has to happen. A lot of you probably know I'm first generation in this country, so I come from a family of immigrants, and I have never felt like American history was my history. Of course, it's inextricably linked to my family's history because America can't keep its hands out of proxy wars in Latin America. So sure, it's inextricably linked to a large extent, but the founders aren't my founders to some extent. So, but I find myself so often telling American people their history, telling them about redlining for the first time, being the first one to explain to them what's the real next line of eeny, meeny, miny, mo, or telling them what internment camps even were, or the fact that the internment laws weren't taken off the books in California until just a handful of years ago. I find myself often explaining people's history to them because they didn't know. And in the technical sense, it is my job. That is what your tax dollars pay me to do. So there's that. But in the social sense and in the emotional sense, whose job is it? Whose responsibility is it to educate members of dominant groups about why their domination is against universal principles of justice? In other words, if you or your ancestors created systems that oppress me and my ancestors, why does it fall to me to explain to you why that's not right? So one of the things that I want to talk about, and I invite Reps Cina and Colston to weigh in on this, is the concept of onus, of responsibility. Whose job is it? Whose job should it be to do this kind of education? And I note that, Rep Cina, you talked about the Racial Justice Alliance's platform of ACT, Acknowledge, Create, and Transform. And that first piece, that acknowledgement piece, I think that's the piece that a lot of well-intentioned white people often are probably most comfortable with out of all those three, right? We like to have the dialogue and the conversation. I can't tell you how many, if I had a nickel for every white person who said after George Floyd was murdered on camera by the government, for every person who said, it's time for me to listen and learn. Yes, do that. Please do that. But also, you've got to do something after you've listened and spoken and learned. So I'm going to start with Rep Colston. I invite you to share a little bit about what you think in terms of responsibility. How do we encourage members of dominant groups or people who are not well versed in this information to take it upon themselves to seek out information, and not just seek it out, but then do something with it once they have it?
Thank you, Xusana. I want to share a story. Probably took place 4 or 5 years ago. I live in Winooski. I was approached by a white parent of 2 white kids in our school district, and she got my name, wanted to, pick my brain. Like, let's come up with a game plan so how I can hold our white school administrators' feet to the fire, because she was struggling that they were not embracing the rich diversity that we have in our community, and it's an asset. And she wants her kids to understand that, and that's their world. So we met for the first time at a coffee shop, and it hadn't been 10 minutes into our conversation, and I did time out. I said, I'm going to be blunt, and I know I just met you, but I am not interested in teaching you about, white supremacy culture, white privilege, structural racism. I'm done with that, because as a person of color, when I go there to teach you, it's at the expense of my self-determination. So what I try to impart to her is that she has a responsibility to understand how we got here. And how did she end up on third base? And no, she didn't hit a triple. She was born there because of her privilege. And it's not about guilt. It's about unpacking that and understanding by first looking in the mirror. And she ran with it. And I also asked her to not only teach herself, but teach her own people. And what I did do is I provided her some resources and some ideas of how she might go about that. And she formed this organic process. We called it Circles Unpacking Power and Privilege. And since then, she became the go-to person for other people who heard about it and wanted to, figure this out. But she invited 4 other white folks from our community, 2 of them school board members, and they got together monthly over dinner, potluck, and they unpacked what they read or the video that they all saw, and they had these transformative conversations about how we got here. So it's about responsibility that white folks need to take on. You may not have created this mess, but you benefit from it. And therefore, you're complicit if you don't do anything about it. So there's a responsibility. And I think it's about education. It's about understanding how we got here. And I think so many white folks are oblivious to that because the world works for them. So it's about educating yourself.
Thank you for that. Hearing that story that you told reminds me a little bit about something that Rep. Cina said in his earlier comments, talking about partnership and using the example of Maine and how it was partnership between the tribal government and the executive branch of the state government that allowed that real collaboration for making legislative change. And when we think about Indigenous communities and the sovereign to sovereign relationship that they often have, or the strained relationship that comes with their respective states, it is, I think we all have a lot of mixed feelings around it, right? On the one hand, you think about self-determination and you want people to be able to shape their own destinies. And yet we also can't deny that our Indigenous communities in the United States today are inextricably linked to American culture. And in some respects are just as beholden to the norms of state-created law and policy as the norms and rituals of tribal practice. And so making that balance really did require exactly how Rep. Cina described it, partnership. And so when thinking about, I have to say this, they're doing construction outside my window, and there's a dog that's very opinionated about the construction. So please ignore all sounds but the sound of my voice. Thank you for your understanding. So, so it's exactly that, right? It's partnership. And I saw a little while ago in the chat, I think it might have been Rep. Gannon who talked about not just having partnership and people doing the work and people being at the table, but who's at the table, who's missing and why. I say all that to say that, again, going back to Rep. Cina's comments and talking about that framework of acknowledge, create, transform, I was struck by the middle piece, create, because to such a large extent, what we're trying to do really is a combination of creating, but also of undoing, right? Destroying, if you will, although that word has such heavy connotations, I hesitate to use it. But so much of what we need to do is not just creating new and good policy, but really undoing and removing ourselves from bad policy and from bad practice. And I want to pose the question to you, Rep. Cina, what are some of the sticking points that you have seen in your experience that prevent that partnership from being able to happen between communities and government, or between different factions of government? And what do you think are some of the ways of getting past those sticking points?
Thank you for that question. I'm reflecting on that, on my experience, and on my experience, you know, as a legislator, but also as a community organizer and as an activist on that piece. So I'm going to be brutally honest, yet try to maintain diplomacy. That a lot of times what people of a privileged group consider to be partnership isn't really partnership. So it's called partnership, but partnership, to me, real partnership is you have to be willing to compromise, to sacrifice. You have to be willing to meet people where they're at. And as a social worker, that's like a big piece of the work. You know, it's like, how do you be a chameleon? How do you, you know, assess where a person's at and try to meet them where they're at? You know, when working with the children, it could be as simple as getting down on the floor with the child instead of talking down at them. And so like when the government is meeting with a group that's been historically marginalized, a lot of the times the government doesn't want to get down on the ground, you know? And so I feel like when I'm in the setting of the government, dealing with people outside of government, the way we even structure it, you know, an example maybe would be, you know, the Social Equity Caucus. We wanted to have public engagement around police reform. So we worked hard behind the scenes, and like Representative Colston and Representative Christie are part of that. You know, we worked really hard behind the scenes to push our colleagues to have a survey, to have public hearings, but then we have a public hearing, and in the public hearing, you know, without, I don't think it was by intention, who's the person who was cut off while speaking when others weren't? It was the Black woman. The white men who were cops, who didn't disclose they were police, were allowed to go on past the time limit, but the Black woman who has a strong opinion and a strong voice gets cut off. And not even interrupted, but muted and cut off the screen. So the existing power dynamic is amplified of the people, and I'm not saying it was intentional. There were many reasons why it happened that way that were unintentional, but it's just an example of how we might structure things in the spirit of partnership, but if we don't dig deeper, that the systems of white supremacy and colonization are so deeply embedded in the way that the government functions that we just replicate it. Like we have to actually radically challenge it. Like and what does that look like? We're trying to figure it out, you know? One example of how it might look, we were talking about how to improve our outreach to new American communities, besides just having an interpreter. And I talked with the multilingual liaison, her title, I may not get it right, but it's the director of English as a new language and of the multilingual liaisons in the Burlington School District. And she said what they learned is you have to just have regular meetings with people, build a relationship, and it has to be more than, you can't just do what you do in a normal setting. Like you can't just have an interpreter interpreting something and have the usual process. You have to meet with people and adapt it in a way that is truly inclusive. And I think when we look at barriers to partnership, it's a resistance to the radical changes that we need to make in how we communicate and interact with each other. That if any of us have risen up through the system, like all of us who are state representatives or employees of the government, we've learned to adapt and speak a language to function in that environment. That's not where I come from. It's a very different world where I came from and how people function. So we've learned to become multilingual in a sense, you know, and how to like navigate, but maybe not everyone there has, well, not maybe, most people there haven't, let's be honest. And so I feel like part of our job is to help our colleagues figure out how to I got distracted by the chat, ADHD moment. But yes, another example was put in the chat of how this behavior has played out in our processes when we talk about partnership. So I think we need to really think about that. Like be careful about not just how we behave in the existing structures, but how do we create new structures? And this goes back to Xusana, when you were saying, you know, create, destroy, you know, this balance, you know, of dismantling something and creating something new, that we actually have to think about how are we engaging with people in new ways. And I will say this, and I'll stop, that in my work with the Commission on Native American Affairs, you know, I'm working very hard to constantly say, although I'm the representative and I'm the person who's introducing these things, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? and encouraging a group which is mostly women to seize the power, because we get trained, whether we're a person of color, a woman, a LGBTQ, a person with a disability, we kind of get trained to function in a system where we don't have the power. So we've learned to survive in many ways, and by not stepping into this, not seizing the power, not owning it, not owning our place, but rather how do we maneuver around all these other people who are taking up a lot of space. And I really think part of our job is to encourage people, take the space at the public hearing, take the space. And you know what, if you're not given the space, and this probably will upset some people, take it anyway. Interrupt the meeting, show up and interrupt the meeting. Demand that the government listen to you and hear you, and call it out when the system is being used to silence you. Because the people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, LGBTQA, women, people with disabilities, we are often used. We're often used, in a sense, for other people. I feel like I've said this before. I feel like people want me to make them laugh. They want me to entertain them, and then when I get heavy, they don't want me to talk in a lot of settings. It's sort of like this, that we're welcome when we make people feel better about themselves. And so then it's like, oh, to get things done, I have to make like white people feel better. Like I have to boost, or it's like women pleasing men's egos. Like how much do women have to like placate to men's egos in the world? It's disgusting, honestly. Like, that when I see it, because it's just how we become taught to survive. So I think being aware of all this, true partnership is us being aware of all this and really giving power to people who don't have power, giving them more power, more of a say. And I think as a legislature, we need to do more. I'll stop on this. But as a legislature, I think we need to do more to give power to the people directly. And that's controversial when I suggest this, that a lot of people say, we're elected, we've been chosen to we've been given this power, we shouldn't be delegating power to others. But I actually disagree. I think we should be looking at how to infuse the power back down, that it should be less of a hierarchy and more of a circle. To me, that is transformative partnership. So I'll just stop there. Thank you. Moving on.
Xusana, if I may, I want to share a quick factoid. The Public Religion Research Institute, which is based in Washington, D.C., conducted a national survey. They were looking at race relations. And one of the stark findings that they came up with was that 75% of white Americans do not have a friend of color. 75%. So we may ride on the bus together, but we don't talk to each other. I mean, I have to know you in this white world in order to navigate and survive, but you don't know me. And I think there's a real issue there.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I think it ties nicely with what Rep. Cina was talking about. The idea of getting on the physical eye level of a child when talking to a child, or making yourself accessible, speaking to people, meeting them where they are. The language of government, the language of politics. I see the Lieutenant Governor puts a very insightful comment into the chat about politics and how we reach broader audiences, and why conversations like these often end up happening in spaces that are close to people. And all of this kind of swirls around this idea for me of code switching and pattern matching. That is to say that we're getting so much of the same in positions of power that when that sameness is challenged, it's often met with cutting off of microphones or physical removal from spaces or just ostracizing or what have you. And I'm thinking a lot about the way that we internalize that as individuals. As an example, earlier this year, I was scheduled to have a meeting with somebody, a journalist, I think, and I had us down for 3 o'clock. She thought we were meeting at 2. I had a meeting at 2. So she sends me a semi-brusque message implying that I was late for our 2 o'clock. And I automatically assumed that she was correct. that I had messed it up. I apologized profusely for missing our 2 o'clock, and I thanked her for accommodating me at 3 o'clock. When I went back and checked my calendar, because all of this was happening during a meeting, but not a meeting with any of you. I pay attention when you all are there. But when I went back and checked, I discovered that actually I had it correct, but my default assumption was that I didn't. And so I think to a large extent, people of color, young people, women identified people, people living with disabilities, we are existing in a space that trains us to second guess ourselves. And as a result, that impacts whether we are given power or whether we feel empowered to take or seize power, as Rep. Cina encourages us. That has a lot of downstream mental health implications as well in our personal interactions with one another. Do we feel comfortable making or having or knowing or finding a friend of color if we don't even know how to interact with people of color? Because people of color are not in the halls of power like we are. We have about 10 minutes left, and I would like to ask a question that I personally find useful. And I would like to ask Rep. Colston to begin. And the question is, thinking about civil rights, truth and reconciliation, discrimination and bias, etc. What would you say is a red herring that people often get hung up on, that you would instead like to encourage them, don't get lost in the weeds on that issue, because this other thing is what you should really focus on? Can you give us one example of that, please?
Sure. I really think it comes down to the difference of taking it personally or understanding the bigger picture, the systemic issues that are at play. I believe that we always land on the personal, and it's so easy to try to deflect, defend. I'm a good human being. And we all strive to be a good human being. I understand that. But I think people miss the mark to understand how we're impacted, all of us impacted, by this white supremacy culture that has been in place since the very beginning of this country. So it's just the whole idea of just being blind to it. And I remember years ago when I was involved in an effort to have a conversation with community leaders and people in our criminal justice system, and we came up with this Uncommon Alliance in Burlington, and actually at that point we were, I think, one of 2 states or 3 states in the country that did not collect data on police stops based on race. And so we got into this, it was like a 2-year conversation before we finally did something. But the police chief at that point from Winooski, Steve McQueen, who was known by others as well, has this notion that my officers don't see race. We're colorblind. And I would just hold it in. It's like, what are you talking about? I mean, you don't see me when I walk in a room as a Black person? I'm sorry. Like, how can you defend that? So it's this whole notion of being colorblind, trying to deflect it, and not understanding how you and yourself are harmed by this system. And I think that is really what's the issue when we talk about how do we move forward? Because until white people understand how they're impacted by this system, how they're dehumanized by this system, then we're not going to move forward, because it's going to take that kind of awareness and rebirth. And I'll just share this one last thought. I was at UVM a couple years ago, co-facilitating a workshop on Race, Power, and Privilege. And one of the participants asked me, what's the opposite of being racist? And I said, being fully human. If we were fully human, we wouldn't be talking about this. And I think that's what a lot of white folks need to understand as they look in the mirror. Am I fully human?
Thank you for that. One of the things that you just said that really resonates with me and that I often find myself talking about with folks is the collective benefit of equity and the collective harm of inequity. Oftentimes in a state that's 94% white, it's really easy to say, well, that doesn't impact me. It doesn't directly affect my life. Oh, but it does. Just as an example, in Vermont, if we had paid people of different ethnic groups the same wage for the same work, if we had wage equity in 2015, our statewide economy would have been $0.42 billion higher, billion with a B. Every single Vermonter benefits from a larger, more robust state economy. And all it took would have been paying people fairly for their labor. We know that in education, when you have educators of color, particularly in primary and secondary schools, you have better academic outcomes, not just for students of color, but also for white students. There are better role models and more opportunity for advancement and for well-roundedness and well-roundedness of perspective when you have more diverse faculty. So there is definitely a collective benefit to equity, and I think I would agree with you. I think that's something we really have to get more people to realize. Rep. Cina, I'm going to ask you to take just a couple of minutes to let us know, what do you see as a red herring that people often get hung up on, but you'd rather redirect them to another more fruitful path?
I'm quiet because I'm really thinking about that one. And Hal, you really just, you brought up some good ones. I'm not sure I have a good answer just off the top of my head. It's like the idea of the red herring, is like the thing people get distracted by, right? The thing that they bring up and they focus on. And I'm trying to think about this. Maybe the best way is to just reflect on some of the recent stuff I've observed in the youth. That in Burlington, we had the youth-led movement for against police brutality, and in that movement, it's BIPOC led. So it's interesting to see this different model playing out where the white youth are actually just doing what they're told, even if it might make them uncomfortable. They just it's almost like haunting sometimes, or cult-like, like they're told, do this, and they just kind of do it. But that's so foreign to me in my life experience where BIPOC ask people to do things and white people just do it without question, because normally, the red herring is there's all these questions that get thrown up. One thing I think I saw Mark Hughes post that maybe is coming to mind now as I'm talking about this is the whole, what about this group, or what about me, or what about that group? For example, we're talking about reparations for descendants of enslaved people, and somebody says, well, what about all the poor white people in rural Vermont that we're not doing anything for? And it's not like that's not a legitimate issue, but why is it that every time we start to go down the path of racial justice, this economic justice issue is thrown up and the attention's thrown back onto the white people? Can't we just take some time to acknowledge how Black Americans have bore quite the brunt, of the harm, and how this entire economy, including the modern day economy in Vermont, has been built on the backs of enslaved people and on stolen land? We can't do that for a minute. It does not take away from the real struggle of rural white Vermonters. And I don't, I'm sitting here feeling bad even saying this. That's the training we go, this is the cultural training we go through, is then we're made to feel like we can't say anything, So I guess I would use that as one that I think people get distracted by, and that Mark Hughes brought up earlier, which is, what about this group? What about that group? And really getting people pulling us away from the topic at hand. And I think we can give attention to the topic at hand and then zoom out and look at the greater economy and look at how, in general, if you're a working person, and I mean if you make less than $400,000 a year, maybe even it's a higher amount, that we're all being exploited by a very small percent of people, you know, that is a bigger issue. But in that, we can't lose sight of the history and how we got here. So I'll stop there because I do want to leave more time for others. And I think I gave my red herring. So thank you.
Thank you for that. So we've got about 3 minutes left, which is perfect. It's 1 minute for me, 1 minute for you, and 1 minute for you. So I have a lightning round question. This is going to take 30 seconds, and I'm going to start with Rep. Cina and then move on to Rep. Colston. But I'm actually going to invite everybody else who's on this call who has chat function ability to give your own answer to this question in the chat box. And I'm finishing typing the question right now. Should I write that word? Yep, I'm writing it. And it's a fill in the blank, and I will give an example. So I just put this in the chat, and I'd like you to fill in the blank for yourself. If you're trying to advance equity and you're still blank, or if you're not blank, then you're not doing a damn thing. And I will start as an example. If you're trying to advance equity and you're still matching your goals based on population representation, then you're not doing a damn thing. And I say that because, just as an example, if you have 1% of women in, I don't know, biochemical engineering, it is ludicrous to say, well, we're just going to try to keep it at 1% because that's how they're represented in this STEM field, right? The idea is you want to grow. So that's my example. Rep. Cina, we'll start with you. If you're trying to advance equity and you're still or you're not doing blah, then you're not doing a damn thing.
Okay, so I was kind of delaying a little to try to like come up with something. So let's see, if you're trying to advance equity and you're not feeling inside yourself the pain that, you know, the pain, whether it is as a person who's oppressed or a person who is a recipient of the benefits, if you are not feeling that pain, then you're not doing a damn thing. You know, no, what do they say? No pain, no gain. Like, I think this work hurts, you know, so.
That's excellent, thank you. And I see some really great submissions coming in the chat, hearing folks saying, if you're still focused on your own guilt, if you're still feeling comfortable, if you're not building relationships and friendships with communities of color, these are great, keep them coming. Rep. Colston, I leave it to you. What would you like to fill in this blank? You have the last word.
Sure. I would say you're not dealing with your own oppression, because we're all oppressed.
It's like A Tribe Called Quest. You got to say the whole sentence.
Oh, okay. I'm trying to pull it back up here. Where is it? Okay. Oh, here we go. If you're trying to advance equity and you're still not dealing with your own oppression, then you're not doing a damn thing.
No, you are not. I thank you both. It's been a privilege to have this conversation with you, and I'm going to turn it back over to the HRC to take us home.
Thank you.
Thank you. What a great question to end our Civil Rights Conference this week. Thank you, Xusana. Thank you, Representative Colston. Thank you, Representative Cina. As our conference comes to a close, I want to thank all of our speakers and panelists and moderators for being here and sharing your wisdom, insights, and experiences with us. The obvious goals of this conference was to promote dialogue around housing and maybe provide some educational tools and a path forward. But the underlying hope was connection. And there was a theme this week, and it wasn't just housing, it was our stories. They were stories of houselessness, stories of accessibility, stories of discrimination and affordability. I was particularly moved by Sarika Tandon's telling of Mr. Eddie Carberry's 5-decade-long protests in Africaville. My heart responded to Safakor's personal story of disability, discrimination, and accessibility. And I was surprised by Commissioner Hanford's story of finding housing in Vermont and how hard it was for him to do it. Today, we heard the story of our country, a story of how our government strategically segregated our nation, even when communities had started to integrate. And while it is a tragic story, it is also a story that is unfinished. Its future chapters are unwritten. Stories shape us, they motivate us, they push us, and sometimes our stories hold us back. Let us remember the stories we've heard this week. Think about how our own stories might push us or hold us back. Then let us be moved to do the hard work that is ahead. On behalf of all of us at the Human Rights Commission, thank you so much for joining us this week. Goodbye.